as we get more of these products, as we use them, I think the healthcare team is becoming more comfortable. And I think that is definitely felt by patients, caregivers, families. I do agree with you so much that as people get more comfortable with the data and the understanding of these, I think that will help patients and kind of flow over to the whole team.
You're listening to the Oncology Nursing Podcast, where ONS Voices talk cancer, a resource from the Oncology Nursing Society. Through conversations with subject matter experts, we examine the important issues in oncology nursing, from new treatments to patient-centered research to advancements in clinical practice. Join us as we hear from nurses in all facets of oncology care, from bench to bedside and everywhere in between. Welcome to the Oncology Nursing Podcast. Hello, and welcome to the Oncology Nursing Podcast. I'm your host, Jamie Weimer, Oncology Clinical Specialist at ONS. And today we're talking with Mo Schwartz, a professor of pharmacy practice at the University of Cincinnati in Ohio, about the basics of biosimilars for nurses and patients. As a reminder, you can earn free NCPD contact hours after listening to this episode and completing the evaluation we've linked in the episode notes. Thanks so much for joining us today, Mo.
Thank you for having me. I'm kind of excited to talk about biosimilars.
Wonderful. Well, we're excited to hear about them. So we know biosimilars have been around for a while now, but new approvals continue to come to markets. I think it's always worth reviewing the basics, especially for our listeners who maybe are new to oncology. So to start things off, can you help explain the difference between a biosimilar and a generic drug?
I think one of the most important things to talk about when you talk about the difference between a biosimilar and a generic is to really talk about the difference between a biologic drug and what now people call either small drug molecules or small chemical drugs, because that really helps us understand the difference. As you talk about the differences, let's talk about biologics. Biologics, there's a couple definitions. I think most people will understand what they are, but I'm going to say the definition anyhow. It's a medicine that generally comes from a living organism. So that can be either an animal cell or a yeast or bacteria. And so because they're from these living organisms, they are very difficult to replicate. Whereas when you're talking about these small drug molecules, the reason they're called small drug molecules is because their molecular weight is relatively small. They're very well characterized. And so because you have that chemical structure, you can duplicate it. So the difference between a chemical drug and, say, a biologic is that a biologic is more complex. It's very difficult to replicate exactly. So a generic drug is the regulatory pathway used to make a drug similar to a chemical drug, whereas a biosimilar is the regulatory pathway that we're going to talk a little bit about, used to get a drug approved that is very similar to a biologic, but is not the exact replication of that biologic originator drug.
So you kind of mentioned this, but let's dive a little deeper into that point. Is how is the approval process, you mentioned the regulatory process, how is that, the approval process, different if we're talking about biosimilars compared to the generic drug pathway?
I think the approval process, as much as most of us don't want to live in that in our day-to-day practice, is kind of important to understand for these drugs. Biosimilar, it's really important to realize that that's a regulatory term in the United States. So when you talk about biosimilars in the U.S., it is because of how they were approved for marketing versus other places in the world. In the U.S., if you have one of those chemical drugs, those small molecules, there's a pathway that was developed for how they got approved. That's called the new drug application process. And then there is a abbreviated pathway of that process for generics. And the big thing when you're looking at these small drugs or small molecules is to make sure that there's bioequivalence between a generic and that small molecule drug. The difference is for biologics, that's not the pathway that's used. There's a different pathway used to get the drug approved. And it's actually through the Public Health Service Act. So that pathway is still important to look at safety and efficacy to get that biologic approved, but it did not have a abbreviated pathway similar to the generic pathway for many, many years. So it was only with the development of the Biologic Price Competition and Innovation Act in 2009 that developed this abbreviated approval process that looks at biosimilarity. And that was enacted in 2010. So it's real important to realize that there's different pathways. I'm going to say something a little bit maybe off subject, but not. So if you have a biologic that's approved as an originator molecule, it goes through the process that you need to for a new drug. If you have a biosimilar, it goes through an abbreviated or a different process. If you get another biologic drug that's similar to the originator, if it goes through the entire process, it is not considered a biosimilar. So if you have your drug that's approved through the entire process, that biologic licensing application process, that's considered a originator or a biologic product. It's only those drugs that go through that biosimilar process that is considered a biosimilar. And that's important because when you look in the literature, you'll see drugs that, that'll say it's a biosimilar because in Europe, it's considered a biosimilar. But it depends on how it went through regulation to get approved.
That's very interesting. Something I definitely did not know. So what I'm hearing and what I'm taking away from that is that whether we're talking about the generic version of the chemical type drugs versus biosimilars of the biologic drugs, what's important, I think, for our nurses and what they share with their patients is that they both have very regulated, regimented processes to make sure that they are comparable in terms of safety and efficacy to whatever the reference or originator product is. They just have different pathways because of the type of agent they are.
Exactly. For generics, it's important that generics are the same as the brand name product. The differences there tend to be only in inactive ingredients. And for a biosimilar, it's very similar to that biologic. And it's supposed to have no clinically meaningful differences from the reference product.
We'll talk more a little bit later about the education piece, but I think some of these points we're already bringing up are some of those little pearls that nurses should be keeping in the back of their mind. So as they're trying to educate and talk with their patients, they can emphasize some of these kind of simple points that the patients can kind of grasp onto and understand so that they aren't confused or concerned about if what they're getting isn't the kind of quote unquote real thing. So we can talk more about that in just a little bit. So we know that there's, for some drugs, off the top of my head, bevacizumab, we've got a lot of different biosimilar options for several different drugs now. Can you talk a little bit more about how the ordering provider, the prescriber, how do they decide which one to use, whether it's the originator or one of the various biosimilars? What drives that decision-making when they're trying to make a choice like that?
This is a really interesting question, and I think it's a very complex question because the reality of it is a provider can choose which agent they want to use, the originator or a biosimilar. But the reality of it is that decision is often influenced greatly by the practice site, the provider, or also the coverage that patient may have. So if you're talking about a drug used in an ambulatory clinic, when you get that drug recertified, the insurance coverage may be different for a biosimilar versus a biologic. And so that could very much guide which drug is used, which of those agents are used. So when you really look at how it is shaping up about what drugs should be used, it's guided by our implementation of the process in institutions like inpatient, like in hospitals, and insurance coverage in outpatient.
I remember, I think it must have been early on in the biosimilar kind of rollout. And I remember at my own institution, there were some questions, even from the clinical team about, no, I want to use the originator product. That's what was in the study. There were, just some, I think, questions and some unknowns when it was early in the process. But you're absolutely right. Now it's almost, I hate to say, but it's out of the hands of the provider. It's what the payer will allow, what they will prior authorize for that patient so that they get the best cost savings based on what their plan covers. So you're right, it can be a request or a suggestion from the ordering provider, but sometimes it ultimately comes down to what the payer allows based on what that plan coverage has. And then also, as you mentioned, kind of the site, what's on formulary, what the institution has in stock. It's not a simple question, is it?
No, and I think it's really important that providers, as well as the entire healthcare team, is engaged in that implementation of how you're going to do the logistics of the rollout, so that the decision making for what is formulary includes the clinical evaluation from the entire team, as well as the cost, same as for outpatients. So I think it's going to be really important to make sure the voices are heard from all of the stakeholders.
Right. And I think again, about the logistics, I think that would create its own cascade of downstream challenges if the pharmacy is now being asked to stock 8 versions of a biosimilar drug because every person's payer wants or requires something else. And that just, something as simple as space, like where do you keep it all and how do you keep it organized? Those are some of those unanticipated things that have occurred now that we have, having the variety, I think is good for a lot of reasons, but it doesn't come without its own set of unique challenges that weren't a reality before.
Yeah, I think that one of the things I watch with interest are the publications that come out from different health systems saying this is how we have addressed the logistics. And I think those are some really great things to read so that you can find some answers of how to do it best. The other thing is when you look at biosimilars, the choice may be different institution to institution, state to state, depending upon what insurances are like the predominant insurers in that area. So there's a lot of things to consider. And I think it really does take an entire team to kind of make that process work.
Absolutely. And those are the behind the scenes details and kind of frustrations that we hope to never have the patient suffer because of. And those are the types of things that, whether it's the administrative team or, whoever it is that making those decisions on what to have on hand and the process for prior authorization and kind of just moving through that entire logistical workflow that we know happens in the background. Those are the types of things that we never want to be the reason a patient's care gets delayed. And sometimes, unfortunately, it still does put a little bit of a wrench in the process. But hopefully, those are the things that we can try to smooth out and explain to the patient what goes into all of those decisions before they are able to get in their infusion chair and get their medication infused. So lots of moving parts that could be its own separate discussion, independent of biosimilars. But I think important to keep in this conversation as well. So as biosimilars became more commonplace, I think around that same time, there was a change in terms of the naming conventions that we use with biologic drugs. Can you explain that a little bit more?
I think this is one of the more interesting things that came out with biosimilars. When there was all the discussion about how biosimilars were going to impact healthcare, one of the concerns is that there needed to be a very rigorous pharmacovigilance program to make sure that biosimilars, when they came out, if there was differences from the originators, that they would be identified. And so there was a lot of discussion about how would we identify when a patient got a biosimilar. And so there was this naming convention that was floated first and then implemented in 2017 that would help address understanding what particular drug a patient got at every point in care. So the naming is done so that you have the core non-proprietary name. And, we're so used to saying generic name, but in this case, it's not generic. So the core non-proprietary name is the core. And then there's a 4-letter suffix added. Now, those 4 letters are supposed to not mean anything. The original biosimilar that came out, it did have a meaning, but that was because it was before the convention was implemented. So when you see this, you think, okay, that means it's a biosimilar. No, that naming convention was for all biologics that were approved after that FDA naming guidance was implemented. And it's so that when that biologic that comes out, it has that name. And if a biosimilar is ever approved, you would be able to differentiate. The reason I think this is so interesting is that I remember after this whole naming convention started to take place, that new biologics would be approved and they would have these 4 letters and people were really confused. Does that mean it's a biosimilar? So it took some re-education that no, all biologics now have that suffix and it's not just the biosimilar. So originator as well as biosimilars. And you see this with all the new biologics that are being approved. They have that 4-letter suffix at the end.
The originator products that were approved before that change, did they get a suffix added as well, or do they just have the core?
They just have the core. So you don't see those suffixes added, which again, kind of makes it a little more confusing, right?
Right. Well, I think that's interesting. And I think, You're right. That was something that I struggled with, just not really understanding all those differences as those naming changes came out. I think it's also interesting because all biologics moving forward are now going to have that suffix. It also takes away, I think, that assumption that, oh, well, if it has the suffix, it's biosimilar. And maybe if I misunderstand what that means, I'm going to think that it's not as good as the original. And the original doesn't, it kind of makes it a level playing field of that all drugs, whether they're originator or eventually become biosimilar, they're all going to look the same in terms of what that naming convention looks like. So it takes away maybe some of that inherent bias of how we read the name and what we interpret it to mean.
I think it's funny too, because like when you look at the literature about these drugs, they don't have that suffix added to it. So if you're going to go and look at the phase 2 trial of a new drug, new biologic that just was approved, you don't include the suffix because that's not part of what, like when you go and do your Medline search or however PubMed search, you don't do that. So that's kind of funny. And then the thing I always say is when I make slides, whether I'm teaching at the college or whatever, I no longer can use spell check effectively because those 4 letters, they always come up as not being spelled right. So it's taken a little bit to get used to, I think.
One question I see fairly often, like on our ONS communities boards, becomes the question of when you're consenting a patient who is getting, whether it's originator or biosimilar, how do you fill out that consent form so that in case that agent is eventually potentially swapped out for a different biosimilar, they don't have to re-sign consent if it's essentially the same drug. What are your thoughts on that whole process?
I've seen that question come up a lot, and I'm a big one for using the non-proprietary name. I think that's really important. I think that there are so many oncology drugs now, and there are so many new ones coming out that if I use brand name, I am likely to confuse agents. So I think using the non-proprietary name without the suffix core name is a good way to go. The conversation about biosimilars with patients, if that's something that needs to be done, I think that's a little bit different add-on issue.
So let's talk about that a little bit more then. When we are educating our patients, what are some tips or some strategies that our nurses or our pharmacy colleagues can use when they're educating patients that the agent that they're giving is a biosimilar? Is it something that you think should be, talked about and emphasized from the beginning, or how do you approach that conversation when it comes up?
The way I approach it is to discuss it, to address it, but not to emphasize it, because then I think it almost creates a question in the person's mind about, is this as good? We saw that with generics. We see that with biosimilars. And I really think that people need to know that this is the drug that you're using. They're pretty much overwhelmed, at least from my experience of doing patient education, just even about the side effects. You know what I mean? So that I really like to focus on this is what the drug is. I mention if it's a biosimilar. I explain it. I give resources if they want it. But I really try to focus on the things that they're going to need to know in order to, help be part of their care, but have readily available information to give them if they want more. You'll come across people that want more information on any aspect of care. So it's always good to be able to have something available for them that meets the need of addressing their questions.
I think that can be a challenging conversation. Now that we have so many biosimilars available, I imagine that it's maybe not as uncomfortable to have that conversation or to explain, since it's not just a handful of drugs, but actually lots of drugs, and they're coming out seemingly all the time now. So I think that has hopefully helped kind of normalize the idea of a biosimilar. But I know, especially early on, it was a challenging and delicate conversation. And, as you said, you don't want to add burden or worry to a patient's mindset when they're already dealing with so much. At the same time, you certainly want to be able to speak clearly and confidently on what the differences are and how it should not and will not impact their response and their outcomes to the treatment.
I think you bring up something really important. As we get more of these products, as we use them, I think the healthcare team is becoming more comfortable. And I think that is definitely felt by patients, caregivers, families. I do agree with you so much that as people get more comfortable with the data and the understanding of these, I think that will help patients and kind of flow over to the whole team.
You had mentioned, providing those resources both to patients. And I think as the healthcare team becomes more comfortable, as we try to educate our peers, or if we have new colleagues joining our team, do you have any suggested resources, education materials, or places online maybe that could be referenced just to find that educational material?
Yeah, it's funny. I'll talk about materials for healthcare providers. I think that, okay, and I'm not just saying this because it's ONS. I think ONS has a phenomenal library on biosimilars. So I think that's great resources. I think there are great resources in the American Society of Clinical Oncologists. So ASCO has great resources. I'm a member of the Hematology Oncology Pharmacy Association, and HOPA has some great resources. ISOP, which is an international society for oncology practitioners, they have great resources. So a lot of the organizations have come up with resources for the healthcare workers that they support. And that's really helpful. To me, that's really helpful. I also find that the FDA has great resources, not only for providers, but they have beautiful education pamphlets for patients and caregivers. I love those. And if I'm talking to someone who's brand new to the concept of biosimilar, whether it be a healthcare worker or a patient, I use those FDA resources because they're really well done.
I agree. And they always have very nice pictures and images. I'm always like, this makes it make sense when I can see it. Those are great resources. And we'll be sure to link some of those in our episode notes today as well. Another question, one final question, maybe just on the topic of education and sort of back to logistics. Do you have any recommendations, or can you talk us through what the process that you're familiar with in terms of when a new biosimilar comes and is maybe going to be used at your institution? Is there a sort of a standardized way that is introduced to the care team and rolled out so that everyone is kind of prepared and ready for it before it is used for a patient?
I can speak a little bit to the University of Cincinnati and what I've seen other places. One of the things I will reference if people are interested in maybe larger institutions, there was a great article by Carr, and it talks about implementation. So it's canvassing those products that come out when they come out. And the Purple Book is an online resource you can look to see with new drugs when they're coming out, when they're planned to come out. Then they're usually done through a formulary review. And because a lot of the drugs are oncology drugs, we have a subcommittee before it goes through the whole formulary review, and then reviewing contracting, availability, looking at the insurances that prefer it. And then after that's done, implementing it through the electronic health record. So that's one of the other big things I think that most institutions have addressed is how you can order a drug and then they can select which drug, whether it be the originator or the biosimilar, based on maybe issues such as insurance coverage. So those are some of the strategies I think people have worked out within their institution.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for talking through that. I think that's, again, one of those parts that sort of in the process that's somewhat hidden, or it's not always the first thing that we are focused on as nurses, and nor should we be, because we should be focused on that patient, but incorporating just the knowledge of what that process looks like in the background. And so we can accurately inform our patients and set their expectations of what they can expect, whether they're hearing from their insurance company, hearing from the financial services at the institution that they're getting their treatment. That's part of the process. As you said, I think early in the episode, we don't always want to live in that space, but we have to know about it. And we have to incorporate our knowledge into how we talk with our patients and keep them informed of their care. Well, Mo, thank you so much. You've provided us a great summary of the basics of biosimilars, and I feel like we've all learned or been refreshed on what we knew. And I think, it's just great to keep this information top of mind because these agents are going to continue to influence our practice and be an option for our patients for a long time to come. So as we wrap up our episode today, we just like to go through a few little summary questions. To start things off, can you tell us, what do you think a common misconception is about biosimilars?
If I was thinking about issues that have been myths over time, I think one of them is that they're not evaluated fully. And so even though the robust evaluation of biosimilars is really well publicized and people talk about it all the time, I think people have this fear that they're not looked at closely, and they really are. So I think that's one of the big misconceptions. And I think the other question out there in people's mind is, do these save money? But, the whole rationale of biosimilars is to create competition, to assure that prices can go down for these extremely pricey drugs. And I think we still are in that new phase where we're trying to figure out where the money saving comes for healthcare, whether it's for patients, whether it's healthcare overall. And I've been pretty excited about, some of the papers I see, or I just got something this morning on LinkedIn talking about price savings with biosimilars. I think that we really need to keep an eye out for that, because that promise, I think people are concerned it's not going to come to fruition, but I think it is.
That's very interesting. Well, as you said, we should keep our eyes on that and not lose sight of what part of the original intent of all this was. Next question, what's something about this topic that's not often discussed, but you wish people knew more about?
I don't know if this is like opening a bag of worms. I don't know if that's the right phrase either. But one of the things I don't think people realize is that when a biosimilar is gone through the regulatory process, it does not have to have big phase 3 clinical trials in all of the indications for the originator drug. The whole purpose of this abbreviated pathway is to show that it is highly similar. So you don't have to redo the studies in every disease state that you're going to use the drug in. That's called indication extrapolation. That's something I just don't think people are aware of. So if you go and you say, this is the biosimilar, I want to look for the study of it done in breast cancer, and you can't find it, that's why. You don't have to. That a biosimilar, if it meets all the requirements as a biosimilar, the manufacturer may seek approval of the product for additional indications for which the originator was licensed.
This is interesting. I'm not sure I was aware of that either, so I'm learning things along with our listeners. Next question. What additional training or education do oncology nurses need to understand biosimilars?
The funny thing is, when I think about this is now a topic that's been out there for a while, but nurses, pharmacists, providers, they all need to know what the rules are in their organization. So anytime someone comes to a new practice, that's one of the things that should be asked. How do you handle biosimilars here? The importance of state laws in terms of things like interchangeability, those things are really important. The other thing I would ask if I was somebody new to an organization, who are the resources within this institution or this practice that I can go to about biosimilars? I think the practical logistic things that you and I were talking about are the things that I would really be focused on if I was a nurse.
Absolutely. And I think, as we know in nursing, especially right now, we're having lots of staffing changes, shortages some places, new nurses that are brand new to nursing practice that are now in oncology, which formerly that was usually a role that only experienced nurses moved into. And so now we're seeing not only new nurses to oncology, but new nurses, period. And so, as you mentioned, a lot of us kind of old timers are becoming more comfortable with biosimilars because we're familiar with them. But as our team is changing in terms of their experience level, we can't take for granted, what they understand about biosimilars, because this might not be something that is seen, whether they saw it in their education or they're seeing it in other places that they've worked. It just might not be a concept that translates if they're not seeing that in their specialty. Final question. Do you have any suggestions for additional resources that patients or providers can seek out who just want to learn more?
I do think the statements by ESCO are really good. One of the things I tend to do is, to be perfectly honest, I just go in a search engine, type in biosimilars periodically to see what kind of reviews are out there, what things have changed. As I'm saying that sounds like I am like the biggest nerd in the world. It is a good way to see what new information is coming up. And I do think using your organization's resources, because again, ONS has done just a phenomenal job of creating resources for the practitioners in all types of topics. And biosimilars is certainly one of them.
Well, Mo, as I said before, thank you so much for sharing your time and your expertise with us. I certainly know that I learned a few new things that I wasn't aware of, and I know that our listeners have done the same. Do you have any final comments to share with us today?
The only thing I would say is that I look forward to seeing the impact of biosimilars in terms of cost savings for patients overall. I mean, it may not be like as obvious as you would like it to be, but certainly that's the reason that this process was developed. And I certainly hope that ends up being what it does for patients.
Well, thank you again so much for sharing your time with us today, Mo.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Oncology Nursing Podcast. Tell us about your favorite part in this episode by leaving a review wherever you download your podcast. For more resources and information about oncology nursing, visit us at ons.org or voice.ons.org. The ideas and opinions shared in this episode represent those of the guest and not necessarily ONS.